have done in this session, but I'm going to place it within the context of developing countries. So our work at the University of Oxford that I'm involved in is mainly on Uganda and Zambia. Both of these countries have access rates to electricity that are below 30%. So the setting, of course, is quite different. And looking at this problem really of mini-grids, a lot of the talks today have been focused on technical aspects, and of course, rightfully so. It's very important to improve these things. If you think about this in an African context, I have an engineering background myself, but the more I think about it, the more I kind of divert into the social and political and policy side of things, because there are so many challenges on these ends that I think, if you want to solve this problem of scaling mini-grids and scaling energy access, you actually have to think a little bit outside of the box. So it's three things that I want to talk to you about today. First one is mini-grids in connections to the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has defined, these 17 goals. I would like to talk a little bit about the barriers that we have, why are mini-grids not taking off in low-income countries, and some of the solutions that we can do to overcome them. So this is a picture of a mini-grid in Zambia, I believe, and mini-grids are commonly associated with a number of sustainable development goals, and there's been a lot of literature looking at these correlations between energy access and some of these development goals. And you can see, intuitively that there are some positive correlations with things like zero hunger, because you can power irrigation systems for agriculture, you can do agro-processing. Same with health centers. If you have a rural health center that has access to electricity, you can store vaccines. You have light, which of course makes a huge difference for health service development, deployment. Quality education, the same, right? Schools with lights and internet access make a big difference. Clean water and sanitation is also a big problem in sub-Saharan Africa. I think water access rates are around 30%. So for people not having to pump this, but actually store it and then do this via solar energy, it's also a clear synergy here. Decent work and economic growth. An obvious one, we can't imagine our economy without electricity access. And so if you want to modernize, there's a clear argument that you need electricity for it, right? What I would like to focus on are the two sustainable development goals that probably or get talked about most in terms of mini-grids in low-income countries, and that is affordable energy access and climate action. So what kind of impact can mini-grids have towards these goals? Let me start with the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is energy access. And energy access, here we pretty much take it for granted. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, it's still a huge challenge. So the goal reads, we need to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. So let's look how that stacks up. The price of electricity in Africa, it can be 20 times of that what we're paying here. And there's a lot of people that complain what we pay here. The main reason is you have poor souls like this man carrying around a small diesel generator, so he now has to source diesel in some remote location and then generate a few kilowatt hours from burning that diesel. That price can be around $4 or $5 per kilowatt hour. And the people are paying that. That's how desperate they are. And here we have 20 cents kind of prices. So it's a huge difference. In terms of reliability, it's funny when I read these studies on network planning in kind of developed countries, we have allowed system outages of maybe 3 minutes in a year or something. We've heard our friend from Indianapolis saying, I think you were sizing it for 9 hours, right? So in sub-Saharan Africa, the situation is dramatically different. People have often outages for many days on end. Firms experience 8.5-hour power outages per month, and this is just where data is available. The real figure is probably much worse. Sustainability, you have a lot of sunshine in Africa, you have quite a lot of wind, quite a lot of hydro. Still only 20% of the continent's electricity comes from renewables, and in recent years we've seen a falling trend because there's a lot of investment in natural gas right now. And then really the big one here is the access to modern energy per se. 620 million people in Africa lack access to electricity. And what is crazy about this number, I mean, it's crazy in itself, but what is even more crazy is if you look at this chart, which compares the amount of unelectrified people now to what it was 2.5 decades ago. And what we see is that population growth in Africa has outpaced connection rates. So now the overall amount of people without electricity has increased by almost 50% in those 2.5 decades. As a matter of fact, of the 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, only 2 have significantly reduced the number of unelectrified people, and those being South Africa and Ghana. Those are the 2 really big success cases. So obviously, mini-grids, and on that slide what we had here, 80% of those people live in rural areas. So mini-grids are really a great opportunity to where the grid hasn't reached, to give, provide electricity to people in sub-Saharan Africa at a cheaper cost, and actually also more reliably so than the national grid could. So there's this huge opportunity for mini-grids in terms of getting access to people. In terms of climate action, I think there are, if you think about future electricity demand in the next couple of decades, there are 3 main sort of drivers of that. One is diversification, so we electrify heat and transport and industry. One is an intensification of a growth of energy in intense industries and services. One is multiplication. So this chart right there, or this icon right there, where 1 dot become 3, is really, that kind of is, I think in Uganda, as one of the countries I work on, the fertility rate is 5.7. So every woman on average gives birth to 5.7 children. So like 1 person becomes 3 kind of makes sense there, right? If you have a marriage with an average of 6 children, that's what it looks like, right? So you have an increasing number of people that demand electricity. And now I think what, I was positively surprised in this conference. We heard it time and time again that there's a huge difference now between developed or industrialized countries and low-income countries, where this demand is coming from, right? This whole issue of diversification, intensification are really things that we in industrialized countries are worried about, but our population growth is more or less stagnant or even slightly decreasing, whereas in low-income countries, the demand of electricity is driven mainly from multiplication and a little bit of intensification. So the 2 problems are quite different. So let me look at, let me just try to rough size the potential of implementing mini-grids in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and what they can do in terms of carbon emission savings. This is a projection of the electricity demand over the next roughly 3.5 decades. And you see an average of 4.6 per annual growth in electricity demand. That is by far the fastest of any world regions. Sub-Saharan Africa is projected slightly more than South Asia, but it's both more or less in the same ballpark. And you see that these numbers here change a little bit. Currently, it's 8% of the global demand that goes to 34% of the global population. And in the future, in 2050, we see 15 to 20% for 45. So it's still a big energy inequality globally, but the gap is closing a little bit as these countries are projected to develop. Now you can, from these demand projections, you can infer certain capacity needs, of course, strongly dependent on what kind of energy mix that you're using. The more renewable you are, of course, the more capacity you need. And then there have been a number of studies, and I don't really want to bore you with the details, but that have then estimated from those numbers what could be the mini-grid potential, where it would actually be cost optimal rather than expanding the grid to very remote areas where you have very low population density, to actually do it with mini-grid, and also, because mini-grids are able to foster productive use of electricity to do this. These numbers, I would say, are slightly, they're kind of a mean between different studies that have come out here. And if you just convert that, and if you look at what South Asia is using right now, what Sub-Saharan Africa is using right now in terms of the electricity generation, and what the future generation mix is supposed to be. In the future, you can then calculate back the CO2 emission savings on a life cycle kind of scale. And I've done that again. I don't want to bore you with the details. It's kind of a back of the envelope calculations, but you see annual savings of up to sort of 390 million tons, but this is annually, so this is annual average. So of course they will, by the time in 2050, they will be much higher than that because of the increase in demand. So let's think, so that kind of gave you a rough idea of the potential impact of mini-grids for both energy access and climate. Now let's talk about the issue why they haven't really taken off yet. We've seen these dramatic access gaps that we have, and I would say there are three main problems that we have to address. One is around policies, one is about the economics, and one is about technical barriers. And I think actually I ranked them. It's not 100% clear, and it's a bit give and take, but I think that's also the order of importance here. The first one is policy. So there's a lack of political will for off-grid investments. We see it. Power Africa is a US-sponsored initiative to increase power access in Africa, and they are putting a little bit of money, but still the vast majority still goes into on-grid, despite the fact that these mini-grid systems are a much better business case for electrifying a lot of these people. We have regulatory issues that I don't want to talk too much about, but some countries have pretty much no regulations on mini-grids, so a developer goes in, doesn't know what to do with mini-grids at all. Some countries have actually over-regulated the problem, where you have so many rules that it can take you 18 months to just get a license to build a small mini-grid to electrify 200 people, right? So these issues exist. Economic barriers, mini-grids don't recover cost usually, so the investment cost you can't recover, so it's quite hard for the private sector to come in. And that's usually because you have low demand in these settings and low purchasing power. And then technical barriers, they're not being integrated in energy planning that much. So energy planning is still very much grid-centered. And there's a high storage cost and short battery life cycles. So let's talk a little bit about the solution outlines here. This one for me on the policy side is really about breaking a paradox. Because if you look at how countries have electrified, you see, sort of countries that are industrialized and developed now, they all electrified in the first half of the 20th century. They all did it through state-sponsored initiatives. And there was no cost recovery requirement, right? The government did this and said, here we electrify, and then at some point we'll see some dividends, maybe decades down the line. Then a bunch of emerging and very fast-growing countries now they develop more in the second half did the same thing. Yeah, very very much state-sponsored. For instance, South Korea allowed a payback time for rural customers of 35 years. So they provided something in the 70s, and some families were still paying back that. So there is no business would do a business case with like 35-year payback times, right? Today, in some African countries, like what do we have there? Ethiopia, Uganda, Ghana, Zambia. It's also, if you look at the grid itself is also very heavily subsidized, state-sponsored. There's also no cost requirement. But now if you look at the very poorest people at kind of the bottom of the pyramid, there the governments just say, no, we're not doing it. We don't know how to do off-grid. The private sector, you do it. I spoke to the Ministry of Energy in an African country recently, and they said, we don't have any business in this, the private sector can solve it. So you're asking the private sector, for a cost recovery requirement that has never occurred, in the history of electrification of people. So for me, that's a bit of a paradox, especially if you think about what are the cost implications. As I said, these per household connection costs of mini-grids can be much lower if communities are far removed from the grid. Just an example here from Uganda. A 33 kilowatt line costs $160,000 per kilometer to connect to build. So if you have a community 10 kilometers away from the grid, you're already just the capital cost of building these lines, you have $1.6 million that you could invest in a mini grid. That's definitely enough to power a 500 household community, given the demand, and probably even more. So that really shows you that you should do something on the policy side. Now, in terms of economics, how do you make mini-grids viable for the private sector? So if you say, okay, the private sector is doing this, how can you actually recover capex for the private sector to go in? And this is a bit of a counterintuitive argument I'm trying to make. I'm trying to say, if you go into low-income countries, you usually want to invest as little capex as you can and get out of there, right? What I'm saying is your business case increases if you increase capex. So what you're supposed to do is not just buy a mini-grid, but actually help these low-income countries, communities overcome the problem of buying appliances in the first place. Because if you just put a mini-grid there, that doesn't mean that they actually use power as well, right? So they have to you have to buy appliances for them and then sell that as a service. So there's this company that did this, build a cooling facility, $20,000 more in terms of capex, but then this little generation that they use, they can actually almost double their revenue. So you've just increased your capex by maybe 10%, but increased your revenue by, I don't know, 60, 70% or something, right? Because an hour of cooling is much more worth for farmers than an hour, than kilowatt hour of electricity, because now you can store your vegetables, you achieve much higher prices, you're willing to pay for it. That of course requires crucial local knowledge of the community. Energy planning, just very quickly, that's some work that we have been doing to try to integrate this on a technical side, to actually integrate off-grid energy planning into long-term models. So you have a load, and you can meet it through the grid, through standard generation and transmission expansion problems, but then you also have this off-grid element that you also put in at the low voltage level, and you can think about, if it's a long-term model, that you actually connect that back to the grid once the grid arrives in these communities. We did it for Uganda, and you actually see that, I think in the model, about 50% of household connections till 2040 will come in a cost-optimal way from these decentralized things. So you have some areas like these districts here or here where you don't have any grid at all. It's just all off-grid, pretty much. This is my last slide before the conclusion. Just a main, just one outlook on storage. I don't personally work on storage. There are some people here that do, and I'm very happy about that, because I think from a design perspective, storage is really the big thing. You have a lot of project design cost, but those would scale down rapidly if you were able to scale them up. This example here specifically was quite a big grid system. It's a bit not really representative, but this storage problem is really a thing, because this is just the overnight investment cost, but these batteries you probably have to replace twice or maybe 3 times during the life of a mini grid. So this cost is actually going to increase, whereas PV now, all this PV in Africa and India comes from China mainly, is so cheap. It's really not in the PV sector. It's all about the storage system that people are worrying about. Fantastic. So let me conclude. There's 3 messages. I've tried to make a point that mini-grids have a large potential to help achieve several SDGs in developing countries. I believe that there are different policy, economic, and technical issues that we need to address. And I believe that the solutions that we need is, one, a policy push for off-grid energy and really putting finance behind it from both the donors and national governments. We need innovative and service-centric, community-centric business models to improve this, and improvements in both energy planning and storage to scale mini-grids to their full potential. Thank you very much.
Question? Yes, in the back.
So not long ago there was a talk about situation in India from Tata Power, which is kind of similar. So one of the key idea there is maybe you should extend from just energy to perhaps energy and water, and that kind of opens up the value chain. What's your thought on that in the situation of Africa?
So that's a very good idea. You should definitely do that. So maybe just to repeat the question was whether it makes sense to include a provision of electricity with provision of water. As I said in one of the slides, it's definitely, there's a synergy. I see, in terms of a business model perspective, I see a bit of a challenge, because water is quite difficult to monetize, because people will drill wells and just pump the water, and they don't really pay a lot for the water they have. So you can probably charge a little bit for water just from a developer's perspective, but it doesn't necessarily make your business stronger. That is not to say you shouldn't do it. You should definitely do it, but then you would kind of, in order to make it viable, get finance in from impact finances that finance water access programs. So absolutely, it's a super important thing. The cool thing about water, if you do it for irrigation, you can store it very easily during the day, right? You just put it in a tank and then use it whenever you need to irrigate. So it's a good way of balancing out some of these grid issues.
One quick question, and why don't we transition to the next speaker, just so we get this question in, please.
So in terms of business models, is it possible to transfer it one by one? So what we understand in Europe or in the US, or two people in Uganda, let's say, have their own, let's say, opinions about the sustainable business models in their area. So do we entirely understand what are the needs in the region?
That's an excellent question. And what we're looking at actually in the Smith School right now is understanding the ecosystem around these developers, because what we're seeing is that there's a lot of European companies and Western companies going in, and they really struggle with understanding the actual needs, right? And so what they are doing, some of them better than others, actually engaging local companies, and you now have like an entrepreneurial scene that provide these services on the ground to really understand what are the sites, what do these people need, and you know, this whole availability and ability to pay. So it's an absolutely crucial point, and you need local entrepreneurs and local businesses